Yo, what's going on, y'all? It's me coming at you again with another vid. So this is actually my first response video to a guy that I got to know on the YTBC, who's is a great guy, man. I mean, he has a wealth of knowledge and he does knows his boxing, and yeah, just so this is an honest debate. It's an honest response. No beef. Trust me, we're gonna do this the rational way here. All right. So he put out a video, and his name is 978diplomats34. So if you guys don't know who he is, please check out his content. It's great. Subscribe and share. Obviously, subscribe and share his content. Okay. Now, he put out a video about distinguishing the records between Bernard Hopkins and Gennady Golovkin at the age of 33. And he was trying to state the case, or actually he was stating the case, that Gennady Golovkin has surpassed Bernard Hopkins as record achievements at the age 33. Well, I'm here to show you and to tell you and show you why that's pretty inaccurate. And I'm going to show you why Hopkins still, his resume is way better than Golovkin's at the age of 33. As you can see, this is John David Jackson. Okay, this is one of the guys Hopkins fought at the age of, up to the age of 33. Now, the other guy here is Lupe Aquino, which 978 Diplomat, you forgot to mention in your presentation. Now, Lupe Aquino is another guy that Hopkins fought up to the age of 33. All right. Glenn Johnson. One guy that you did mention in your video. All right. But I'm going to obviously mention Glenn Johnson here. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning these guys is because these guys is opposite. I'm going to prove to you why these guys that Bernard Hopkins fought up to the age of 33 are far superior than the level of opposition that Gennady Golovkin fought up to the age of 33 right here. And of course, we have Simon Brown. Now, brother, you did openly admit that you didn't know who Simon Brown was, even though you did give Hopkins credit for that win. But I'm going to show you in this presentation why Simon Brown is a much greater fighter, including the other fighters I just mentioned a second ago, much more greater than the level of opposition that Gennady Golovkin fought, and I have to reiterate that. So, let's look at John David Jackson's record, his resume. John David Jackson is a two-division world champion, okay? Now, his greatest wins on his record is against Reggie Johnson, a guy who defeated Steve Gollins, who was a great super middleweight and middleweight. Lamar Kid Fire Parks, who at the time was an up-and-coming middleweight, who his only loss was to Reggie Johnson, but by decision. But, of course, his career got cut short due to the fact that he got tested positive for HIV. I mean, sad case. But his significant losses were to James Toney, Roy Jones Jr., and Antonio Tarver. Now, Reggie Johnson is a two-time world champion at the middleweight division. All right. Yes, he has losses on his record, but those losses that he had were very significant, as I just mentioned a second ago. And he's never been knocked down by anybody. Never been knocked out. I'm sorry, not knocked down. He's never been knocked out. He's never been stopped in his career. Okay. And of course, he is a former world champion, and he's defeated world champions like Steve Collins. Okay. Now, Steve Little, on the other hand, this is a very unique case here because Steve Little was a guy who, I mean, he was a very good fighter based off, than what his record suggested. I know he had a terrible record of 25 wins and 17 losses, but most of those losses came from significant opposition that he fought. Now, his greatest win on his record was against Michael Nunn. All right. And then he lost to Terry Norris, Tyrone Trice, and James Toney. Then you had Tyrone Trice, very good fighter. Chris Pyatt, who defeated the great Steve Collins, and Davey Moore, who defeated Wilfred Benitez, Hall of Famer, and Lupe Aquino, which you forgot to mention, defeated David Brown, Milton McCoy, who was a great welterweight, and people Aquino's Hall of Famer, and lost to Martin Sterling and Donald Curry. Now, Lupe Aquino, a former world champion, all right? Of course, he lost to Don David Jackson and Marlon Sterling, who was a great middleweight. A great welterweight at his time. And let me tell you why this Marlon Sterling. Let me tell you something about him. He never got stopped in his career. Never got stopped. The only time he, you could say, not exactly a stoppage, he lost a fight where he suffered a accidental headbutt, and the referee had to stop the fight. And of course, it was a 6th round, and he had to go to the cards, and he lost that fight on the points. but at the same time, he never got stopped. He was one of the very few middleweights at the time that moved. I'm sorry, middleweights, welterweights that moved up from 147 to 160. It challenged Michael Nunn at the time, who was a linear champion. He didn't take any tune-ups. He fought him and see if he could test himself, and he felt that he could try to replicate the success of Sugar Ray Leonard when he moved up from 147 to fight Marvin Hagler coming out of retirement at that time. Starlin defeated Mark. He defeated Lloyd Hannigan, who upset Donald Curry at the time, who was the undisputed welterweight champion. Mark Breland, he drew with him. He defeated Simon Brown, Floyd Mayweather Sr. twice. And I know a lot of people like to discredit Floyd Mayweather Sr., but he was a very good fighter, even though he wasn't, though he was pretty underachieved. But he lost to Johnny Bumpins, who was a former world champion. Maurice Blocker was a good world champion at the time. Of course, Michael Nunn lost to Donald Curry twice. Now, Donald Curry is the first welterweight to unify all three belts in the early 80s, okay, becoming the undisputed champion. The first guy to do that. Now, of course, Lupe Aquino defeated Milton McCory, who defeated Doug DeQuitt, a former world champion. McCory was also a great welterweight at his time. Very good fighter who lost to Mike McCallum in a war. Cuevas, Hall of Famer, as I mentioned, Davey Moore. And, of course, I don't know why I repeated this, but as you can see, his resume is pretty solid. All right. Now, on to Glenn Johnson. Now, Glenn Johnson is very unique. Royal Warrior, as they call him. Now, Glenn Johnson has a lot of losses on his record, okay? Yes, he has 21 losses. But you have to understand, he's only been stopped twice in his career. Now, leading up to the Hopkins fight, he was very avoided. Nobody wanted to fight this guy because he was just running through people. But until he fought Hopkins in their fight in 1998, I think it was 1997, I believe, when they fought, Hopkins knocked him out. Now, Hopkins is one of the only two guys that Glenn Johnson had suffered knockout losses to, despite him having 19 other losses, plus the 2 knockouts, all right? He was a former world champion who lost to Savin Akting, who's one of the greatest super middleweights of all time, who retired undefeated. He beat Antonio Tarver. He lost to Carl Froch. He lost to Tarver, too, at the same time as well. Lost to George Groves. Lost to Chad Dawson, which I think that was disputed because I think Glenn Johnson won that fight against Chad Dawson. Of course, Johnson has been robbed many times in his career. He lost to Lucien Boutte, Andrew Fafar. Of course, he's been past his prime. Andrew Fafar defeated Chavez Jr. and Nathan Clevery, former world champions. And now Chavez Jr. is was handed down the world championship and knocked down Adonis Stevenson, one of the few guys to do it. As you can see, he defeated Montel Griffin, who was undefeated at the time, who defeated James Toney twice and Roy Jones Jr. once. And Darius Mock, as you can see, was a multiple super light heavyweight. Roy Jones Jr., of course, Antonio Tarver, and Clinton Woods, who was also a pretty good light heavyweight champion. All right, who defeated Torvo's Cloud, Antonio Tarver, obviously. Now, Simon Brown, the guy you didn't know about. Now, Simon Brown is a 2-division world champion, okay? He had 8 consecutive defenses when he was a reigning welterweight champion. Of course, I don't know why I repeated this. Forgive me my typos. I was up all night trying to do this. He lost to Buddy McGirt, who was also a great champion at his time, Tyrone Trice, and David Reed. Now, actually, he beat Tyrone Trice, so I guess that's a mistype on my behalf right there. He beat him twice. Now, the reason why I mentioned Tyrone Trice is because, yes, he didn't have, he lost some of his big fights, but he was a solid contender and he was a dangerous fighter. Yet, he was a lot greater than what his losses suggested. So that's why I include Trice because, he had wins over Freddie Pendleton, who, by the way, is one of those guys like Stephen Little, who has a gang of losses, and Kevin Pompey as well, who has a gang of losses, but those guys became world champions at the later of their career. Like, for example, Freddie Pendleton, who beat Jorge Paez, who was also a great lightweight champion of his time. So, look at the fighters he defeated. Terry Norris. Now, Terry Norris, look at Terry Norris. If you don't know who Terry Norris is, please check him out. Now, Terry Norris beat a lot of great fighters. John Mugabe, retired Sugar Ray Leonard the first time. Meldrick Taylor. We all know who Meldrick Taylor is. Donald Curry. Maurice Blocker. Okay, Terry Norris is undoubtedly one of the best pound-for-pound fighters of all time, okay? This guy was unbelievable. Yes, he was a vulnerable fighter, but he was a very sighted fighter, very powerful, very quick, and just unbelievably skilled fighter. Just take a look at him, all right? Maurice Blocker, who defeated Marlon Starling, who was a great champion of his time, but lost to Felix Trinidad and, of course, Terry Norris. Okay? Now, Simon Brown, that Terry Norris victory is very, very significant in his career because Simon Brown went in as an underdog, all right? Nobody gave him a chance to beat Terry Norris in the first fight. But what did he do? He went in there, he figured out Norris's holes when it came to his defense because obviously he was a vulnerable guy because Norris had this tendency of keeping his stance too wide and keep this guard wide too open, which made him vulnerable to straight shots in the middle and, of course, jabs. So he beat Norris in the first fight. He defended his title against Troy Waters, who was a pretty solid contender at the time too, who gave Norris a scare in their fight in 1993, which I called in my previous video the Hagler Hearns of the 90s. Knocked down Norris, almost knocked him out, but solid contender. Then he rematched against Norris, where Norris, completely showed his boxing skills and outboxed Simon Brown. Now, Simon Brown was was past his prime when he fought Hopkins, but at the time he was the number one ranked contender for the IBF, so he was a mandatory to Hopkins' title. So that's why that fight got made, and that's why I still give Hopkins credit because he didn't select Simon Brown. Simon Brown was the number one rated contender, so he took on his mandatory. Now, this little slide here that you put up, it's very unique and it's very informative. I'll give you that, man. But here's why this is a little bit flawed here. You see, you mentioned that Hopkins didn't have a unification at the age of 33, which is true. He didn't. But you neglect to mention that the champions at the time, which is Keith Holmes, and who was the WBC champion, and William Joppy, who was the WBA champion at the time, they or their management didn't want no part of Hopkins. They knew how dangerous he was. They didn't want no part of him. So that's why they couldn't get that unification bout with him until later, until 2001 or early 2001, when him and Keith Holmes finally fought in a unification bout. And, of course, Hopkins beat him. William Joppy, of course, he got knocked out by Felix Trinidad. And, of course, when Trinidad knocked out Joppy, that's what set up that undisputed bout between Hopkins and Trinidad. All right. Now, Golovkin, on the other hand, he has the interim title and the IBO titles. Now, here's the thing about this. The IBO title is a minor title, so it's not recognized, so you can't count that. All right? The WBC interim title is just a trinket, and it's a variation of titles that you can't really count either because the WBC only hands you that crown unless, let's be honest here, they hand people the interim titles because, just like the WBA and the WBOs, because they figure out if they can hand out a various titles like the interim title, they can get sanctioning fees from these fighters. So the interim title, seriously, there's many fighters who won interim titles, but they're not considered great champions, great fighters. All right, so let's not go there on that. Now the WBA super title, you listed here that the WBC interim title, Golovkin is not the official WBC champion. We all know Canelo Alvarez is. Now the WBA title, here's where you made an error here. Golovkin became the WBA super champion when Felix Stern at the time was rated the WBA super champion for a 4-year reign. Golovkin became the WBA interim title at one point, all right, when he knocked out Milton Nunez, all right. Then he got upgraded to become the regular champion, but he was not the official WBA champion, again, because Felix Stern at the time was, all right. But when Stern vacated the title and moved up to super middleweight, that's when Golovkin got upgraded to become the super WBA champion. And that's when he defended it against Daniel Gill, who is a good fighter, who's actually the greatest win of his resume, to be honest with you. So that's where you made a flaw there, my friend. Yes, the 16 world title bouts and the 15 defenses, yes, you have to subtract the 10 defenses that Golovkin had as a regular champion, which did not certify him as the official WBA champion. So you have to subtract those 10 defenses from the 15 that you put in this title comparison presentation here. So with that said, Hopkins still had more defenses compared to Gennady Golovkin's 5. And the reason why, because in Hopkins' era, there weren't many variation of titles. There weren't any, by that matter. So again, in the 90s, it was, we have alphabet belts, but there weren't no variation of titles, barely any. Now, let's look at Gennady Golovkin's resume. Yes, he defeated Kasiuma, who was a loudmouth guy who thought that, Winky Wright was ducking him, blah, 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 but won that title in a vacant fashion, then lost it to a lesser opponent, all right, by Ramon Karzyan, who's a pretty good fighter, but he pretty much was a lesser opponent than Uma, all right? Now, Uma defeated Ferno Phillips. I got to give him credit for that, all right? And he defeated Marco Tuno Rubio. So those are his greatest wins of his resume. Guess who he lost to? Gabe Rosado, Vanez Monterosian, okay, and Jermaine Taylor, and K9 Bundry. All right? Gabe Rosado, okay. His greatest win of his record is against Joshua Clottey just recently and Kasiuma. All right? And, of course, he lost to Peter Quillen, Jermell Charlo, David Lemieux, of course, Gennady Golovkin. Matthew Macklin. Now, Matthew Macklin, okay, let's look at Matthew Macklin's resume, all right? Matthew Macklin, his greatest win in his record is against a way over the hill Euroboy Campos, all right? Euroboy Campos. If you don't know who he is, check him out, all right? He was a very good fighter in his time, all right? Nobuo Yoshida, yes, a very light-fisted, feather-fisted puncher who won an interim title against a nobody, all right? And then, he lucked out against James Kirkland, who didn't have Ann Wolfe in his corner at the time when they fought. All right, then let's move along. Curtis Stevens, greatest win of his record is against Toriano Johnson, which I felt that he was given that decision because Toriano Johnson was still in incapacitation where he could continue to fight. So I don't care what anybody say about that. Daniel Gill, as I mentioned, the greatest win in his record. And we see the fighters that Daniel Gill defeated. Felix Stern, Robert Kazarian, who I just mentioned, Sebastian Sylvester, Anthony Mundine. So Daniel Gill is a 3-time world champion in the middleweight division. So that is a very, very significant win. Marco Tulio Rubio, who was only an interim champion but lost all his big fights, all right? Martin Murray, a guy who constantly gets robbed. Now, Martin Murray, very good fighter. No question about it. It took, pretty much one of the few fighters that almost took Golovkin to the distance, but unfortunately he got stopped. So it is what it is on that side. Now, the greatest win on his record is... Hold on, somebody's going to beat me up here. Was against... Well, actually, he doesn't have a significant win, so I'll take that back. So he doesn't have a significant win at all. Dave Lemieux. Of course, his greatest significant win is against Nassan Nadam Checkham. All right? Now, if you want to compare and contrast, the bottom line is this, man. You had a great presentation, but Hopkins' opposition when he fought, who he fought up to the age of 33, was much more greater than the level opposition that Gennady Golovkin has fought up to the age of 33. All right? The guys that Gennady Golovkin fought, yes, they fought interim champions, but those guys are not certified champions. And those guys that they fought, their opposition was terrible. Some of them were good, but they're terrible. Let's be honest. I mean, they can't compare to the opposition that Simon Brown has fought. They can't compare to the opposition that Lupi Aquino fought, John David Jackson has fought, or Glenn Johnson, we all know, has fought. So these guys had defeated former world champions, great champions, and Hall of Famers. Compared to Gennady Golovkin, whose level opposition probably won't even get to that stage. All right? Won't even get to at this point. Maybe Daniel Gill, maybe at some point of his career, but the other guys I mentioned on his resume, no. That's not going to happen. I'm sorry. It's not going to happen. The only way for Golovkin to get there is to get Canelo Alvarez. That's the only fighter I see that can get, that he has to get on his resume. And once he's able to do that, obviously I'll give him full credit. Now, this is not to discredit Golovkin, but these are the facts, man. And these are the, look at the level of opposition. You got to compare and contrast to the level of opposition that Hopkins fought at the up to the age of 33. Now, mind you, Hopkins only fought 4 guys. And those guys were very, very significant and far superior, as I have to mention again. All right? Now, there was another point of that presentation you mentioned rankings. I know that was pretty clever, I have to admit. But the ranking system is pretty flawed, as you can see, man. We all know that, all right? Now, for example, look at the heavyweight rankings right now. They got Zars Glafkov that's ranked number 6 in box rank, okay? But in the Ring magazine, he's not ranked in the top 10. So why is Zars Glafkov, who's a very, very limited heavyweight, is ranked in the top 10? Because he's undefeated? He's ranked number 1 by the IBF? Okay. And Luis Ortiz, he's finally in the top 10. He deserves it, but he's not ranked in the sanctioning body. So the ranking systems are very, very flawed. All right. So I wouldn't really go with that system right there, because even though those guys weren't ranked in the top 10 based off your chart, but those guys fought Hall of Famers, and they were all great fighters. Okay. And they beat great champions. That's on record. And their level of opposition is far superior compared to what Gennady Golovkin's level, his opponent's opposition have fought. Far superior. Okay? Now, the guys that you mentioned, Peter Gwillan, Danny Jacobs, and Billy Joe Saunders, and all the rest of those guys. I think Torio Johnson, I think you mentioned in there, I believe, and Chris Eubank. Now, you have to understand, yes, you made a good point. Those guys are avoiding him. But the problem is that Golovkin won't get those guys now that he's going to turn 34 next year. It's not going to happen. Now, if he had put those guys on his resume, then yes, you could argue and say, well, maybe you could say he's done more than Hopkins at the age of 33. But since he did not get those guys on his resume by the year's end, he's not going to get that credit. I mean, it's the way it is. So, to conclude this video, the bottom line is this: Hopkins is still greater than what Gennady Golovkin has done at the age of 33. Still is, based off the information I showed you, and based off all the stats that I just showed you right there, the level of opposition that they have fought. Okay, I didn't break down the numbers because that would have took too long. All right, all right. But the thing is this: you have to look at the level of opposition that they have fought, and compare and contrast to the level of opposition that Gennady Golovkin's opponents have fought. All right. Now, I'll leave it at there. So, again, this is an honest debate, man, and I appreciate you doing this presentation because I think this is something we need, man. We need a civil, honest conversation about things like this, and not go off to rants and beef and stuff like that because we disagree with one another. No, that's not what we do. So, these are all facts, my friend. So, anybody else, let me know what you think about this presentation. Am I right? Am I wrong? Comment, subscribe, share, sign it off. Peace.